Josh did so wonderful a job introducing this series last week. Parables, of course, are illustrations, fictional stories that Jesus used in his preaching to reveal the truths that he was trying to convey to people. They are the principles of Jesus' ministry put into real lifestyle situations that he tailored to the people he was talking to. They included situations that his audience would have been familiar with, and that's what we see again here in Matthew chapter 13. Beginning in verse 24, it says, "Another parable he put forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. And while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat," tares being like weeds. "Sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. When the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? And he said, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them. But gather the wheat into my barn. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Another parable spake he unto them, The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened." So we begin here, as Josh taught last week, with another parable about farming. A man sows wheat in a field, enemy comes and sows some weeds in among it. When the crops spring up, the sabotage is revealed. The servants say, well, let's just go and tear the weeds out. But the householder, the master here, is smart enough to know that with this being a young crop still, if you go in and try to pull the weeds up, you're either going to tramp down the wheat or you're going to pull the wheat up with it. And he said, no, we'll just wait until harvest time has come, and then we'll be able to tell what's good from what's bad. We'll have the reapers gather the weeds and burn them because they look a whole lot different than wheat. And then we'll gather the wheat and put that in the barn. He backs that up immediately in Matthew's telling here with a story about a man who sows mustard seed. Mustard is evidently Jesus' favorite condiment. He talks about it way more than mayonnaise or ketchup. But in all seriousness, when I was a kid, Dad had this card in his Bible, he still might, that had a tiny little mustard seed laminated into the plastic, and it was printed with that verse from Matthew 17 about faith, and how if we just had faith the size of a grain of a mustard seed, we could say to the mountains, be ye moved, and they'd be moved. But Jesus is using mustard in a similar way here, but a little bit different. In that part of the world, that mustard seed, and if you've ever seen one, it's hard to imagine anything smaller. Hard to imagine anything more humble than that. But in that part of the world, with the climate, the way things grow, when you plant that mustard seed, it can grow into a shrub-sized plant that can get up to 8 feet tall. So big, Jesus tells us here, that the birds can rest in its branches. Now, the third parable departs from the theme of farming a little bit, and he talks about baking. And I'm not, the accomplished baker that my dad is. He's giving y'all some good recipes. But I do know this. If you look at a recipe, the amount of yeast that you add to the flour and the sugar and whatever else is way less than everything else. You might add, is that right? You might add a quarter of a teaspoon or a teaspoon compared to this big bowl full of other stuff that you're putting in there. A little leaven, we find out elsewhere in the Bible, leavens the whole loaf. And Jesus tells us these stories and says that this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, what is that supposed to mean? How in the world are we supposed to think that the kingdom of heaven is somehow like these three parables that don't have a whole lot in common on the surface? What is that supposed to mean? How are they similar? What are they supposed to tell us about this kingdom that Jesus is coming to establish? Well, I think if we look at these stories, the thread that ties them all together is waiting. In that first parable, we see workers who are completely right in their urge to go and get rid of the weeds that the enemy has sown in amongst the wheat. Their intentions are good, but they're too eager, they're too impatient to wait and do it in the right way. If the master hadn't stopped them, who knows how much of that wheat they would have lost. The master is wise enough to say, no, we'll wait. Wait until the crop comes to its full fruition, and then we'll be able to tell. In that second, that mustard seed, as I said, grows to be taller than, Jesus says, grows to be taller than any of the other herbs. 8 feet tall. So big that birds can rest in its leaves. But Jesus' audience would have understood something that he leaves unsaid here. It takes time for that mustard seed to grow to that level. You can plant, I'm not much of a gardener either, but I'm married to a real good one, and I know that you can start most herb plants, and it's just in a couple of weeks you're already reaping from what you've grown. But mustard, to reach that full fruition, you're already picking your basil and your rosemary and your thyme and your salt. It can take months for mustard to reach that level that he's talking about. It's something you have to wait on. In the third parable about the leaven in that meal, any recipe that calls for yeast, you know that at a certain point, as you get down the list of instructions, they all say the same thing. Let it rise. Give it time. Let the yeast do its thing. Now, Jesus is saying this woman is mixing leaven into 3 measures of flour. 3 measures is about a little over 1 bushel. 1 measure, rather, is a little over 1 bushel. And converted to pounds, that's about 27 pounds worth of flour that she's hiding this little leaven. So yeah, that little leaven is going to do its job. That yeast is going to infect every bit of that meal. It's going to do what it is supposed to do. But it's going to take time. Even instant yeast isn't instant. And they certainly didn't have that back then. Jesus is saying, I think the kingdom of heaven is like patiently waiting. But wait a minute. I mean, elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus tells us, in Matthew's own Gospel, in fact, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is here. Jesus' ministry is the inauguration of the kingdom of heaven. In Luke chapter 17, the Pharisees ask Jesus when the kingdom's going to come. And he says, the kingdom cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, lo here or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. It is here. It is at hand. But then he says in these parables, it's something that we're waiting on too. And that conflict, that tension, it can be hard to reconcile. And to be honest, if we're confused, we shouldn't feel too bad, because the people Jesus told these parables to were often confused. If you read on in the same chapter, after the crowds go away, the disciples come and ask Jesus to explain the meaning of the parable of the weeds. And knowing what I know about the disciples, I tend to think that while Jesus was preaching, while everybody else was there, the disciples were standing back and going, with their hands on their chin, like nodding thoughtfully. And like rubbing their beards and like, yes, Jesus, another good one. Yeah, we totally all understand everything. And then as soon as everybody else is leaving, it's like, Jesus. Now, I really enjoyed that sermon you preached, but what did you mean? So Jesus tells him, in this instance, he explains to him that the one who sowed the good seed was the Son of Man, the one that was promised to come to deliver God's people. Jesus himself. The field was the world. The seed was the children of the kingdom. The enemy, of course, was the devil. The weeds that he's sown are his children. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. So at the end of the age, while the righteous and the unrighteous grow up together, and the evil ones aren't plucked out, they're allowed to grow up right alongside. At the end of the age, there will be a separation there. And the unrighteous will be cast into the fire. The righteous will be gathered into God's barn. This was the explanation. Hold on, my pages got out of order here. Thank God for Dropbox here. Hold on. But it's easy. So at the end of the age, there's this separation. There's always this temptation. And Jesus is touching on this in this first parable that he tells. There's always this temptation to take things into our own hands. That's what the workers in the field wanted to do. But Jesus is saying sometimes it's best to just wait. Tom Petty said the waiting is the hardest part, and he's right. But Jesus said in Luke 21, "In your patience possess ye your souls." Jesus was speaking to an audience at a time that was ripe for revolution. Jesus was talking to people who were tired of the state that they found themselves in. For hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, these people had been under an oppression that seemed like it wouldn't end. After one empire after another, when the Assyrians went away, the Romans came. And it just kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier on their shoulders. And they believed that God had promised to deliver them, but sometimes that waiting got too difficult, and they decided, well, maybe God just wants me to help him out a little bit. So even in the centuries leading up to Jesus' birth, we see multiple attempted revolutions. The most successful was the Maccabean Revolution that Jewish folks celebrate around Hanukkah, which briefly did lead to about 50 years of an independent Judah. But they were crushed just the same as any else. They were reduced to just a memory, dust in the sands of time. They were overthrown, and it went right back to the same situation that it had been. As Jesus comes on the scene, there had been multiple self-proclaimed messiahs who had risen up. Some of them you find mentioned in the Bible. But they gathered followers to themselves. They went about preaching. Sometimes they took up swords and tried to start a little insurrection. But all of those came to naught. They were crushed. It's what they said. They were scattered. And so when Jesus comes and he starts preaching, people start to get excited because he's unlike any of these other figures that have come before. The power of his preaching, they say again and again, nobody has ever taught like this man. The power of the miracles that he's bending the forces of nature with these miracles that he's performing. So people think, rightly so, this is the real deal, but it's not. They don't want to wait for it. They recognize that Jesus is building the kingdom of heaven. They hear him say it's at hand, but they weren't happy with the way Jesus is accomplishing it. In John chapter 6, you find that there are people who get so enthralled by what Jesus is saying that they want to take him by force and make him king. His own disciples multiple times are ready to take up arms and install Jesus as the king with a fight. And Jesus has to calm down the situation over and over and over. Certainly Jesus' political and religious enemies thought that that's where things were headed, and that's why they arrested and murdered him, or at least that's why they thought they arrested and murdered him. God used their ill intentions for good purposes. But Jesus says the kingdom is here. The kingdom is at hand. It is established, but also it is something that we have to wait for. It's here in the sense that Jesus told John the Baptist's disciples, go and tell John again what you've heard and seen. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised up. And the poor have the gospel preached to them. Those are the things that Isaiah and all the other prophets said would happen when the Messiah came. The kingdom was here. Go tell John it's happening right now. You've seen it with your own eyes. But you also see a sense of waiting. When Satan offers Jesus that throne during his temptation, he refuses it. When the crowd seeks to make Jesus a king, he disappears and walks right through them and isn't seen by him. When he stands in the halls of Pilate at his own trial, when just a word could have brought that entire place crashing down like Samson pushing on the columns, one word, Jesus said, he spoke nothing. Because the harvest wasn't ready. Because if we try to separate the weeds from the wheat when they aren't fully grown, we're going to end up with a pretty shoddy harvest. There's a temptation even today to hurry up, to speed the kingdom along and give God some help. But as we know, the kingdom's already here. It's just that we have to wait for the harvest to get ready. It's a tension that Jesus' people have always had to live with. But you know what? I find some amount of comfort in that too. Because this idea that a kingdom persists, whether I don't have to take up arms, I don't have to lead no revolution, Jesus has done the work for me. I don't have to be some hero. Look at Peter there on the Mount of Olives. The last hours of Jesus' death, Peter's going to prove to him what he said. Lord, if anybody, I'll be with you until the end. I'll kill for you, Lord. He rips out that sword and chops off somebody's ear. And he just made himself look like a fool. Jesus has to fix the problem that he creates. But living in a kingdom that is both here and one that we're waiting on, it reminds me of what Paul said to the church in Thessalonica in his first letter. He said, as touching brotherly love, he tells the Thessalonians, ye need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. And indeed ye do it, toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia. You're doing a good job, Paul says. But we beseech you, brethren, that ye increase more and more, that ye study to be quiet, to do your own business, and to work with your own hands, as we commanded you, that ye may walk honestly toward them that are without, outside the church, that ye may have lack of nothing. I find it ironic, having just ended this study of Acts that we did, that Paul was telling these people to be quiet, mind your own business, because he didn't ever do that. Everywhere he went, he was starting something up, and he was anything but quiet. But Paul is telling these people, you don't have to be a hero. Thank God we're not all called to be Apostle Pauls. All you have to do is live within the teaching that you've been given. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Have you ever wondered why that is? Because we know we're not justified by how good we act, how good we behave, how good we follow the set of rules that we've been given. We're saved through faith in Jesus. Why would he say, if you love me, keep my commandments? Why go through that effort? It's because if we live in the way that God instructs us, people begin to take notice, because it is so incredibly different, this kingdom of heaven, than the kingdom of the earth that we live in. Living like Jesus asks us to, in that kind of radical love that he calls us to, is planting mustard seeds as you go. You might not see it. You might not see the effects of it. You might not see the fruit. It might not be very impressive.
That's right.
You don't have to be a hero. It doesn't have to be anything big and bold. As you go through life and live the way that Jesus asks you to live, you're sticking little bits of yeast in that dough, and it might not show up. It might have to rest for a while. It might have to rise for a while, but eventually folks will take notice. If we live the way Jesus... Paul's not telling these people to hide their lights under a bushel. He's saying, go plant some mustard seeds. The work is done. Jesus said, it is finished. In his death and resurrection, he killed sin and defeated death. How are we ever going to compete with that? What work are we ever going to do that can compete with that? Jesus has established the kingdom, and he's coming again to finish the work that he started. But for right now, go plant some mustard seeds. Leaven some flour. Let the weeds grow up with the wheat, because if you try to tear one out from the other, you're going to hurt some. It might take a little while. You might have to wait a little bit, but eventually it's going to grow into something that nobody can deny. That love that we show to our neighbor, the forgiveness that we show, as I talked a couple weeks ago, to those who wrong us, the peace that God's children can bring into chaotic situations, those are all mustard seeds that we might have to wait just a little bit longer for them to reach the height and the impressiveness that you might see other people's work springing up and bearing fruit. Maybe your mustard seed's going to take a little bit longer to grow, but eventually nobody's going to be able to deny. People are going to be able to find rest and shelter. As Jesus talked about those birds resting in the mustard seed, people are going to be able to find comfort in those mustard seeds that we plant. We probably won't see the immediate effects. We probably will have to wait until harvest time to see the works of our labor, but that doesn't make it any less important. Someday the harvest is coming and the fruitful crops will be separated from the unfruitful. The mustard seed will have grown into a majestic tree and folks will find rest and safety in it. The yeast will rise in that dough and we'll be able to turn it into something that can feed hungry people. The kingdom is here, but it's also still coming. And God is present in both of those situations. But let me say one thing. Christians don't, it makes, as I said, it makes me feel so comfortable that I don't have to be some hero. I don't have to lead some revolution because Jesus already did it. I just have to live as a citizen, as a foreigner, a stranger in a strange land, a citizen of the kingdom in the kingdom of this world. But if you don't have your passport yet, if you don't have your citizenship yet, when we went overseas here a couple months ago, I started 6 months before making sure we had all our paperwork in line. Now, salvation is instant, but Paul tells us today is the day. Paul quotes in 2 Corinthians, he saith, quoting here Isaiah, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I succored thee. Paul says you've heard that all your lives. You've heard that there's a day coming when God's going to deliver you. Paul says, behold, now is the accepted time. Today, now is the day of salvation. We can rest in the waiting. We can rest in planting our mustard seeds and leavening our meal and waiting for God to turn that into a good thing. But if we're not part of this kingdom already, there is no time to wait, because there's a lot of work to be done, and the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. Today is the day of salvation. If you want to be part of this kingdom project that Jesus is doing, something that's going to fix everything wrong that has ever been. God says in Revelation, behold, I make all things new. And I trust in Him enough to think He means all things. Anything that has ever been wrong, God is actively working to fix it. And He wants you to be part of that project. So you've heard it said, a day of salvation is coming. And I'll echo Paul and say, good news, it's today. We might have to wait to see the harvest. We might have to wait to see what our work has accomplished. But today is the day to get to work. They say there are two best times to plant a tree. One was 20 years ago. And the second one is today. Today is the day of salvation. Today is the day to get to work, planting and living. Thank you for your attention.